Hi folks, and welcome to another lesson from Simply PE, this time in the topic of gaseous exchange and blood vessels. So by now you should hopefully understand how these presentations work, so I'll leave those coloured text boxes there for you to ponder and look at to help you with the instructions for this PowerPoint. But let's first of all look at the syllabus of AQA and what is required from this particular topic. So first of all, as students, you need to be aware of the main features that assist with gaseous exchange within the alveoli. You also need to be aware of that keyword of hemoglobin and understand what we mean by blood pressure. You also need to be aware of the different structures that exist within the different blood vessels within our body and what are those blood vessels' functions within the body. And finally, you need to be aware of those two keywords of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So lots to get through, let's get cracking. So first and foremost, let's look at this idea of gaseous exchange within the lungs and where that takes place. So we know from our previous understanding of this topic that it takes place in that alveoli. Okay, so those small clumps, those small kind of minute kind of grape like shaped air sacs. And it's here where the diffusion takes place. So where there's that transfer of gases from one area to another. So these gases, the main ones involved are carbon dioxide and oxygen, they move down a concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. So that's important to note when we think of that idea of diffusion that happens in those alveoli air sacs. So in essence, what happens is oxygen diffuses from the alveoli, as you can see in the diagram. Okay, so within that kind of circular area here, all right, the oxygen diffuses from a high concentration towards a low concentration. So where the blood capillaries, okay, where they surround that alveoli. So there's a thin wall within the alveoli, and that diffusion can now take place from high concentration to low concentration. And the opposite happens, okay, in regards to carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide is coming from a high concentration area of the blood capillaries, okay, and then it moves to the low concentration, which is the alveoli itself. And when we breathe out, that carbon dioxide gets released, and when we breathe in, the oxygen comes back into the alveoli. So that process constantly takes place as we breathe. I want you to pause your video here and think about what are the key features that help in gaseous exchange in the alveoli. Okay, so one of the things that we talked about was this idea of there being a thin wall around each alveoli. So that helps with that diffusion, that pathway between the oxygen going from the alveoli to the capillaries, then to the working muscles, and the carbon dioxide coming from the capillaries back into the alveoli. We'll look on the next slide now at other key features. So, as we mentioned, key features of alveoli for gaseous exchange to happen. The alveoli, as it says there, are small in size but large in numbers, so we have millions of them within our lungs, and they provide a large surface area, so that helps with that gaseous exchange. We also have thin walls, okay, so the surface walls and the capillaries are very thin, and that helps with that exchange, okay, so that shortens in essence the pathway, because ultimately the alveoli and the capillaries are touching each other, so that helps with that diffusion. We also have a network of capillaries that have a high and rich blood supply, so that helps once again for the oxygen, okay, to go from the alveoli to the blood capillaries, and for the carbon dioxide to be removed and taken away from those blood capillaries back into the alveoli. For the exam, we also need to know about what is hemoglobin. So ultimately, hemoglobin is a red pigment which is found in red blood cells. So if we remember, red blood cells are circulated and transported around the body through our bloodstream. And the purpose of red blood cells, remember, is to carry oxygen to the working muscles, and that's basically what hemoglobin does. It's found in the center of that red blood cell, and oxygen attaches itself, okay, to the hemoglobin, and that forms what we call oxohemoglobin. All right. And then basically that helps to transport that oxygen to the working muscles, which we need because we need that energy when we perform any sort of physical activity. Ultimately, it's also worth mentioning that hemoglobin also helps carry back CO2 back to the alveoli. So that's an important point that sometimes students can miss. In essence, there are three main blood vessels that you need to know about for this GCSE examination, and they are arteries, veins, and capillaries. So the first or the next task I want you to focus on in terms of this presentation is to pause your video here and just try and sketch and jot down those three different blood vessels. So let's look at each of those blood vessels in a little bit more detail now, starting with the arteries. And ultimately, the function of the arteries is to carry blood away from the heart. So it mainly will be carrying oxygenated, rich oxygenated blood. And that blood is normally, because it's got oxygen within it, it will be very rich and quite bright and red. Arteries also have key features in that they're quite elastic, so they're quite stretchy, and they're able to withstand high pressure. And ultimately, arteries will have high pressure within them. They also have thick walls, they're quite muscular, and as it says there, they can withstand that pressure. They're able to stretch and also to return back to normal size. And because they're able to withstand high pressure, they have a pulse which runs through them. Okay, because they're carrying oxygenated blood away from the heart, when the heart, should I say, contracts, okay, that blood is being pushed and transported to the key organs, the key muscles that require that oxygenated blood. And that's why the pressure is high, because that heart is contracting, it's working, it's pumped that blood out. It has a small lumen, and what we mean by that is that it has a small internal diameter. So the hole within the actual arteries are quite narrow, are quite small. Again, I want you to pause the video here and ponder and think about this question. What happens to our arteries if we are overweight? So ultimately, hopefully you've unpaused the video now, you've answered that question. So ultimately, what happens to our arteries if we're overweight? Well, if we're clinically obese and we increase in our weight, we're going to get fatty deposits, okay, which start to clog up that lumen, the artery itself, okay? And ultimately, if you think of a garden hose, for example, and you have water running through it, the water represents the blood which is running through the hose obviously represents the artery. If you put your finger, let's say, over the hose and you squeeze it, okay, that is obviously causing a blockage. All right, and obviously if you don't squeeze it too much, what you start to see at the end of the hose is that pressure of the water to come out harder, and ultimately that would be the same thing happening here. So fatty deposits, cholesterol might clog up that artery, and if we have that, then we have a higher risk of potentially heart disease, a cardiac arrest, heart attack, and so on. So it's important at this stage to mention blood pressure, because as we mentioned before, arteries can withstand high levels of pressure. And ultimately, when we think of blood pressure, we're thinking about the force of blood that passes through an artery. And ultimately, we have two numbers that come up when we measure our blood pressure, and we call that systolic and diastolic. And the diagram on the right hand side really helps you with that. So when the heart contracts and it pumps blood to the working muscles away from the heart, okay, it's obviously working, it's pumping it out, and that number is always going to be higher compared to the diastolic. The diastolic is when the heart is relaxing and blood is coming back to the heart. Okay, as it says there, systole occurs when the heart contracts, okay, and it pumps out the blood, as I just mentioned, and diastole occurs when the heart relaxes after contraction. Again, pause your video here and think about this question. What happens to our heart or our blood pressure during exercise, and why? Okay, so hopefully you've been able to identify, okay, in terms of your answer here, that what happens to blood pressure during exercise is that it increases. So our blood pressure increases during exercise. Why does that happen? Well, if we're working, okay, let's say we're running, for example, we need to get more oxygenated blood to those working muscles, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the gastrocnemius, for example. So our heart needs to pump harder and more often, okay, when we exercise. So that's why that blood pressure will start to increase, because we have the flow of blood, okay, quickening up in essence. So a little bit more about the arteries. In essence, small arteries can widen and narrow, and they adjust blood flow to particular parts of the body. So in the diagram here, you can see as if we would cut an artery, and we can see the cross section of the artery. So the diagram on the left hand side is a normal kind of artery, okay, where we see the kind of the lumen is fairly small, okay, but then we've got two key words that we need to start to look at: vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So in essence, the body is clever at being able to redistribute blood, so we can send blood to different parts of the body, okay, depending on what physical activity, for example, we may be doing. So vasoconstriction, as it says there, is it reduces the diameter of the small arteries to reduce blood flow to various tissues. Okay, so we can see in the middle diagram here that that lumen has got even smaller. Okay, so it's constricted, it's narrowed even further to reduce that blood flow to certain areas of the body. Whereas the opposite might happen when we look at vasodilation. Okay, so here the arteries are now stretching, they're widening, okay, and that is opening up that lumen a little bit larger to allow even greater blood flow to the working muscles that require it. So again, pause your video here and try and answer that question there. When may we see vasodilation and vasoconstriction in action within the body? So hopefully you've been able to identify that it will occur during exercise. All right, so for example, okay, when we think of vasodilation, okay, let's say to the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the gastrocnemius, if we are running, for example, but vasoconstriction will also occur where it may reduce the blood flow to certain vital organs, such as the stomach. Okay, and that's why it's really essential and really important that we try to eat 2-3 hours before we exercise. Okay, because obviously when we eat, okay, the digestive system activates and more blood flow will go to the digestive system, the stomach, the intestines, okay, because we are obviously digesting our food. Okay, and that would be an example of vasodilation. So vasoconstriction reduces that when we exercise because it needs to get to the vital muscles that are being worked. Okay, so let's move on to the veins, and again you can see a diagram there that should help you understand the veins. So the veins' key function is to carry blood towards the heart, and it will carry deoxygenated blood back towards the heart. The key features of it, as I said there, it carries deoxygenated blood. It's also quite stiff, so it's not able to stretch. There's no pulse involved here, so there's a much lower pressure within our veins. They have thin walls and a large lumen, okay, so they're a little bit wider if we cut them cross-sectionally. And they're also valves, okay, within the veins, and that helps to prevent backflow of blood. Why do you think they have a one-way valve? See if you can pause your video here and answer that question. Okay, so hopefully you've answered that. Excuse me. Hopefully you've answered that question. Ultimately, if we think of the fact that there's a lower pressure, there's no pulse involved to do with the veins, we need to have that valve in place to ensure that the blood doesn't flow backwards. We only want it to go in one direction, and that's obviously back towards the heart. So that's why those valves are in place. And then finally, let's look at the last blood vessel, which is about capillaries. So ultimately, the key function of a capillary is that they are huge networks of tiny vessels which basically link arteries and link veins together. The diagram there should show you a comparison of an artery, of a vein, and of a capillary. So capillaries are tiny, and remember, some of those blood capillaries, as I said before, will kind of smother and will cover that alveoli. The key features of a capillary is that they are very narrow, so it helps with gaseous exchange. It enables other rapid diffusion to occur. So blood vessels are great for diffusing and transferring gases, but also things like nutrients. And it's important when we obviously want to gain some of those nutrients from the things that we consume, either drink or eat. But they're also good at getting rid of waste products. So things like lactic acid, carbon dioxide, really important that we try and get rid of those products, okay, when we exercise. And all of that happens, remember, through diffusion. Okay, so just to finish off with, I've got a few revision questions, exam practice for you to do. So again, it is worth now pausing your video here, making a note of some of these questions and seeing if you can answer them. Okay, I've put in the brackets how many marks would be worth for each question. Once you've completed those questions, okay, if you can post it to me via Google Classroom, that will help, okay, because then I can obviously mark and check your understanding. And finally, for the practitioners, in terms of teaching and learning, I think the key few things here for this particular topic is to ensure students have a number of diagrams that help them to refer to being able to visualize those blood vessels. Try and use some special equipment at school if you've got an opportunity to do, to get students to explore their own blood pressure both before and after or during exercise. That's really important. And there are plenty of past exam questions to get students confident on this topic. Thanks for listening and all the best, and I'll see you again soon.